This is the entire story of Chris Redfield, a soldier who spent his life fighting impossible battles. For decades, Chris stood on the front lines of every major bioterror outbreak the world had ever seen. He fought zombies, bioweapons, and some of the most dangerous people on the planet. But Chris's story isn't really about the enemies he defeated. It's about the people he lost, the friends he couldn't save, the partners who sacrificed everything, and the burdens he carried long after the missions were over. Because while many people remember Chris as a hero, very few remember the price he paid to become one. And long before he became the legendary figure we know today, he was simply an older brother trying to protect the only family he had left. At some point during their childhood, Chris and his younger sister Claire lost their parents, leaving the two siblings with nobody but each other. From an early age, Chris wasn't just a brother. In many ways, he became Claire's protector, the person she could depend on when nobody else was there. And over the years, that protective instinct would become one of the defining traits of his character. As he got older, Chris decided to pursue a military career and enlisted in the United States Air Force. There, he trained as both a pilot and a combat specialist, learning how to operate aircrafts, handle a variety of weapons, and survive under extreme conditions. It was during this period that Chris began developing the skills that would later make him one of the most dangerous operatives in the Resident Evil universe. But while Chris was an exceptional soldier, he wasn't exactly the easiest person to command. One thing quickly became clear to anyone who worked with him. Chris had a very stubborn streak. If he believed something was wrong, he wasn't going to stay quiet about it. And if an order conflicted with his personal sense of right and wrong, he wasn't afraid to challenge it. While that made him respected by many of his fellow servicemen, it frequently brought him into conflict with his superiors. Eventually, Chris either resigned from the Air Force in protest or was discharged for insubordination. Either way, his military career came to an abrupt end. But despite leaving the Air Force, Chris walked away with something far more valuable than a rank or title. He walked away with experience. By this point, he had become a skilled marksman, an accomplished pilot, and an expert in hand-to-hand combat. He was particularly talented with firearms and knives, and his shooting ability was so impressive that he would later win competitive marksmanship contests. Perhaps even more importantly, his time in the military introduced him to a man who would become one of his closest friends, being Barry Burton. Neither of them could have known it at the time, but their friendship would eventually help both of them survive one of the most horrific incidents in the Resident Evil series. Following his departure from the Air Force, Chris found himself at a crossroad, but that wouldn't last long. In 1996, he was recruited into a special law enforcement unit operating out of Raccoon City, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, better known as STARS. And for Chris, it was the perfect fit. His military experience, combat training, and natural leadership abilities quickly made him one of the unit's most valuable members. Assigned as the point man of Alpha Team, he built a reputation as one of the best marksmen in the entire department. But STARS gave Chris something even more important than a career. It gave him a family. Over the next few years, he formed close friendships with many of his fellow officers. He reunited with Barry Burton, became friends with Joseph Frost and Forrest Spire, and most importantly, developed an incredibly close partnership with Jill Valentine. The two trusted each other completely. Whether it was routine operation or a dangerous mission, Chris and Jill always knew the other had their back. At the same time, Chris also developed a great deal of respect for Alpha Team's captain Albert Wesker. Like the rest of STARS, Chris viewed Wesker as a dependable leader and someone worthy of admiration. Looking back, it's almost impossible not to see the irony in that, because the man Chris trusted most would eventually become one of the greatest enemies of his entire life. Outside of work, Chris remained extremely close with Claire. Whenever she visited, he often helped train her, teaching her self-defense and survival skills. He even gave her several personal items that would later become iconic parts of her story, including his STARS knife and a gold lighter. By 1998, Chris's life seemed to be heading in the right direction. He had a promising career, friends he trusted, a sister he would do anything to protect, and a future that seemed full of possibilities. But sometimes, all it takes is one night to change a person's life forever. By summer of 1998, something was terribly wrong in Raccoon City. For months, reports of bizarre murders had been appearing throughout the region surrounding the Arklay Mountains. Families disappeared without explanation, hikers were found mutilated beyond recognition, and bodies were discovered partially eaten. And within every new victim, fear continued to spread. The local police struggled to make sense of it. Many investigators believed a violent cult had taken up residence somewhere within the mountains. The brutality of the attack seemed almost ritualistic, and as weeks turned into months, pressure on the RPD continued to mount. Eventually, the case was handed over to STARS, and on July 23rd, Bravo team was dispatched into the Arklay Mountains to investigate. But then they vanished. Radio contact was lost. No distress signal, no explanation, nothing. The following evening, Alpha Team was ordered to find them, and among those deployed was Chris Redfield. At the time, he had no idea he was about to step into the most important night of his life. After arriving in the mountains, the team quickly located the wreckage of Bravo Team's helicopter, but before they could investigate further, something emerged from the darkness. A pack of savage, blood-covered creatures descended upon them. At first glance, they resembled dogs, but these weren't animals, at least not anymore. The creatures attacked without hesitation, and within moments, Joseph Frost was dead. From there, the team was thrown into complete chaos. Gunfire erupted, commands were shouted, and in the confusion, Brad Vickers panicked and lifted off in the helicopter, abandoning the rest of Alpha Team to save himself. With no other options, Chris, Jill, Barry, and Wesker fled toward the only shelter in sight, a massive mansion hidden deep within the forest. At the time, it looked like salvation, but in reality, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Once inside, the team became separated while searching the estate, and Chris soon encountered something even more terrifying than the creatures outside, being a human corpse, partially consumed, and standing over it was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen before, a zombie. For Chris, this was the moment everything changed. Nothing in his military training, nothing in STARS, nothing in his life had prepared him for what he was seeing. But as he continued exploring the mansion, the horrors only grew worse. The estate was crawling with monsters, zombies wandered its hallways, mutated animals stalked the grounds, and gigantic spiders lurked in dark corners. And around every corner was another reminder that something had gone horribly wrong. During his search, Chris eventually reunited with Rebecca Chambers, the young medic from Bravo Team who had somehow survived the disaster. Together they continued investigating the mansion and slowly uncovered the truth. The building they were trapped in wasn't simply a mansion. It was a cover. Hidden beneath the estate was a secret umbrella research facility where illegal bioweapon experiments had been conducted for years. The company that the public knew as a pharmaceutical giant had secretly been developing biological weapons behind closed doors. And somewhere along the way, everything had gone wrong. A virus known as the T-virus had escaped containment. The researchers became infected, the staff transformed into monsters, and the outbreak eventually spread beyond the facility, creating the murders that had terrorized Raccoon City for months. But as horrifying as that discovery was, an even greater shock was still waiting for Chris, because the deeper he dug into Umbrella's operations, the more inconsistencies he began to notice. Questions weren't adding up. Certain events felt planned, almost as if someone had known exactly what would happen. And eventually, the truth revealed itself. Albert Wesker, the captain of STARS, the man that Chris trusted, had been working for Umbrella all along. For Chris, this wasn't simply betrayal. It was far too personal. Wesker hadn't simply lied to him, he had used him. He had used all of STARS. The mission was never about rescuing Bravo Team. It was an experiment. Umbrella wanted combat data on their bioweapons, and Chris, Jill, Barry, and Rebecca, and everyone else had been sent into the mansion as test subjects. Then, things became even worse. Cornered and exposed, Wesker released Umbrella's ultimate weapon, the Tyrant, a towering bioweapon designed specifically for combat. In an instant, it turned on Wesker himself, seemingly killing him before pursuing the remaining survivors. What followed was a desperate battle for survival, and against impossible odds, Chris and the others managed to destroy the Tyrant and escape the facility moments before the entire complex self-destructed. By sunrise, the Spencer mansion was gone, but the nightmare was far from over, because when Chris returned to Raccoon City and tried exposing Umbrella's crimes, nobody listened. Evidence disappeared, reports were ignored, and witnesses were silenced, and before long, Chris realized the truth. Umbrella's corruption went far beyond one laboratory, far beyond one mansion, and far beyond Raccoon City. The company had people protecting it from the shadows, and if nobody else was willing to stop them, then he would. Because on that night, Chris didn't just survive the mansion incident. He found the enemy he would spend the next several decades fighting. While most people wanted to move on and pretend that nothing happened, Chris couldn't. He had seen what Umbrella was creating behind closed doors, and he knew that the Spencer mansion was only the beginning. Determined to expose the company, Chris traveled to Europe in search of Umbrella's operations and executives. For months, he followed leads, gathered information, and searched for evidence that could finally bring the corporation down. But then, everything changed. In late December of 1998, Chris received an unexpected message from someone he had never met before, Leon S. Kennedy, one of the few survivors of the Raccoon City disaster, the same disaster that had consumed the city Chris once called home. Leon informed him that Claire had been captured while investigating Umbrella in France, and worse still, she had been transported to a remote prison camp known as Rockford Island. For Chris, nothing else mattered. The investigation could wait. His sister was in danger, and just like he always had, Chris immediately dropped everything to protect her. Without hesitation, he traveled to Rockford Island. But by the time he arrived, the situation had already spiraled out of control. The island was in ruins. A viral outbreak had spread across the facility. Monsters roamed the grounds, security forces had been wiped out, and the entire prison complex had descended into chaos. As Chris searched the island, he eventually learned that Claire had already escaped, or at least escaped the island itself, and she had been transported to an Umbrella facility in Antarctica. But before he could pursue her, Chris encountered someone he never expected to see again. Albert Wesker, alive. For months, Chris had believed that Wesker died during the destruction of the Spencer mansion. Now, he was standing right in front of him, and something was different. The Wesker Chris remembered was dangerous. The man standing before him now was something else entirely. Faster, stronger, almost inhuman. Their reunion was brief, but it left Chris with a chilling realization. Not only had Wesker survived, but he had evolved. And whatever Umbrella had done to him inside that mansion, it had transformed him into something far beyond a normal human being. After learning that Claire had been taken to Antarctica, Chris commandeered a Harrier jet and followed her there. And for the first time in months, the Redfield siblings were finally reunited. But their reunion didn't last long. The Antarctic facility was quickly descending into chaos as the T. Veronica virus threatened to consume everything around them. Claire soon left to search for Steve Burnside, the young survivor that she had spent the ordeal fighting alongside. Meanwhile, Chris found himself caught in another nightmare, one involving the Ashford family, the creators of the T. Veronica virus, and Alexia Ashford herself. Unlike anything Chris had encountered before, Alexia possessed terrifying abilities granted by the virus, and quickly proved to be one of the most powerful bioweapon threats he had ever faced. As the facility collapsed around them, Chris battled Alexia through multiple monstrous transformations, before finally destroying her using the facility's experimental linear launcher. But even then, his nightmare wasn't over, because waiting for him at the end of it all was Wesker, once again holding Claire hostage, once again forcing Chris to choose between his family and his mission. Refusing to let Claire become a pawn in Wesker's games, Chris confronted his former captain directly, and for the first time, the two men fought. But unfortunately for Chris, the outcome wasn't even close. Despite all his training and combat experience, he was completely outmatched by Wesker's newfound abilities. The man who once served beside him had become something entirely different, something stronger, something faster, and something almost impossible to defeat. Chris managed to survive only by using the collapsing environment to his advantage, temporarily trapping Wesker beneath falling debris. But neither man considered the fight finished. As the Antarctic facility crumbled around them, Wesker issued a final warning. The next time they met, it would be their last. Moments later, Chris reunited with Claire and escaped the exploding base. And for the second time in a single year, the Redfield siblings had survived a nightmare. But Chris had left Antarctica with more than just relief. He left with a new enemy, because Umbrella was no longer his greatest threat. Now there was Wesker, and somewhere deep down, Chris knew their story was far from over. Following the events in Antarctica, Chris and Jill continued their war against Umbrella. For years, the two former STARS officers traveled across the globe investigating bioweapon incidents, tracking Umbrella activity, and gathering whatever evidence they could find. While the world slowly moved on from Raccoon City, Chris and Jill refused to forget. They knew Umbrella was still out there, and as long as the company existed, another tragedy was only a matter of time away. So together, they formed a private Anti-B.O.W. organization dedicated to hunting down Umbrella's remaining operations and preventing future outbreaks. For the next several years, that mission became their lives. Then, in early 2003, they finally caught a lead. Reports had begun emerging from a remote region in the Caucasus Mountains, describing bizarre animal attacks and unexplained deaths. To most people, it sounded like a local incident, but to Chris and Jill, it sounded familiar, far too familiar. Upon arriving in the area, they quickly discovered the situation was much worse than expected. The village had already fallen, the dead were walking, and once again, Umbrella's fingerprints were all over the disaster. As they searched for answers, they encountered a young girl named Anna, one of the few survivors left alive. Through her, they began piecing together what had happened to the village, and uncovered evidence pointing toward a nearby Umbrella facility hidden deep within the mountains. But something else happened during the investigation, something Chris wasn't expecting. Albert Wesker appeared, once again. Years had passed since Antarctica, yet somehow, Wesker always seemed to be one step ahead. Their encounter was brief, but it reinforced something Chris already feared. Wesker wasn't done, and neither was he. Following the trail, Chris and Jill eventually discovered the truth. Hidden beneath the mountains was one of Umbrella's final strongholds, a massive research facility containing years of bioweapon development. Everything Chris had been searching for, everything he had spent the last 5 years fighting against, was finally within reach. Joined by a regional biohazard response unit, Chris and Jill launched a full-scale assault on the facility. What followed was less an investigation and more a war. The pair battled their way through countless bioweapons, security systems, and experimental creatures as they pushed deeper into the complex. For Chris, every hallway felt like a reminder of the people Umbrella had taken from him. Members of STARS, the victims of Raccoon City, the countless lives destroyed by the company's greed. 5 years of anger, frustration, and unfinished business had all led to this moment. Deep within the facility, Chris and Jill finally came face to face with Umbrella's last line of defense, a massive experimental bioweapon known as Talos, created by Sergei Vladimir, one of Umbrella's high-ranking operatives. This creature represented everything Umbrella stood for: power at any cost, human lives treated as disposable, science without limits. But unlike the monsters Chris encountered inside the Spencer mansion years earlier, this time was different. This time, he wasn't fighting to survive, he was fighting to end it. Together, Chris and Jill brought the creature down and escaped the facility as Umbrella's final stronghold collapsed around them. After years of investigations, sacrifices, and chasing shadows, Umbrella was finally finished. The company responsible for the Mansion Incident, the destruction of Raccoon City, and countless deaths around the world was gone. For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare was finally over. But even as the dust settled, Chris knew there was still one problem left unresolved. Being Albert Wesker, Umbrella may have fallen, but Wesker was still out there. And sooner than later, Chris knew they would meet again. With Umbrella finally gone, many people believed the nightmare was over, but Chris knew better, because destroying Umbrella hadn't destroyed bioterrorism, it had simply scattered it across the world. The company's research, its weapons, and viruses, all of it had found its way onto the black market. And now, countless organizations were racing to acquire what Umbrella had left behind. The threat hadn't disappeared, it had evolved. Determined to stop a new generation of bioterrorists from repeating Umbrella's mistakes, Chris and Jill helped establish a new organization dedicated to combating biological threats around the world. They called it the BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. For Chris, it had represented something he had been fighting toward for years, an organization capable of responding to outbreaks before they became another Raccoon City. And unlike STARS, this time he intended to make sure corruption never had the chance to take root. Over the next few years, Chris and Jill became two of the BSAA's most trusted operatives. The pair traveled across the globe investigating outbreaks, dismantling bioweapon operations, and preventing countless disasters before the public ever learned they existed. In many ways, this was the peak of their partnership. The two had survived the Spencer Mansion, survived Umbrella, and survived Wesker, and together, they had become one of the most effective anti-bioterror teams in the world. But in 2005, another crisis emerged. A mysterious organization known as Veltro appeared to be active once again. This immediately raised alarm bells throughout all the BSAA, because years earlier, Veltro had been responsible for one of the deadliest bioterror attacks in recent history, and now there were signs that they might be returning. To investigate, Chris was partnered with BSAA operative Jessica and dispatched to a remote mountain region in Finland. Almost immediately, things began going wrong. Communications were lost, strange creatures began appearing, and evidence suggested a new virus was involved. Meanwhile, Jill launched a mission of her own to locate Chris after contact with his team was lost. For a brief period, the two found themselves separated, something that rarely happened, and perhaps fittingly, neither of them handled it particularly well. While Chris pushed forward through the snowy mountains, Jill crossed the Mediterranean searching for any sign of her partner. Eventually, their investigations converged aboard a massive cruise ship known as the Queen Zenobia. There, Chris and Jill reunited, and once again fought side by side against a growing bioterror threat. Together, they uncovered a conspiracy involving the Terra Grigia panic, government corruption, and a dangerous new pathogen known as the T-Abyss virus. As the situation escalated, the pair found themselves battling through hordes of mutated creatures while racing to prevent the new virus from contaminating the ocean. The mission eventually led them to the ruins of Terra Grigia itself, where they confronted Jack Norman, the former leader of Veltro. Driven by revenge, Norman infected himself with the T-Abyss virus and transformed into a powerful bioweapon. After an intense battle, Chris and Jill succeeded in bringing him down and exposing the truth behind the incident. With the conspiracy finally revealed and those responsible brought to justice, the BSAA emerged stronger than ever. The organization was expanded into a global United Nations operation, and Chris quickly rose through the ranks. By this point, he had become one of the BSAA's most respected agents, a veteran with years of combat experience, a leader that others looked up to, and a symbol of the organization's fight against bioterrorism. From the outside, everything seemed to be going right. Chris had finally found purpose, the BSAA was thriving, and Jill was still by his side. But unfortunately, that would not last, because the next mission would take them directly to the source of everything, Albert Wesker himself. And before it was over, Chris would lose the partner that he trusted most. By 2006, Chris Redfield had spent nearly 8 years fighting the consequences of Umbrella's actions. Umbrella itself was gone, but the damage it left behind continued to spread across the world. And perhaps most importantly, Albert Wesker was still out there. For years, Chris and Jill had chased rumors, investigated outbreaks, and searched for anything that could lead them to their former captain. Then finally, they got a break. The BSAA received intelligence regarding the whereabouts of Oswald E. Spencer, the founder of Umbrella, the man whose company had unleashed countless horrors upon the world. If anyone could provide answers about Umbrella's origins, Wesker's plans, or the future of bioterrorism, it would be Spencer. Together, the two agents traveled to Spencer's secluded European estate, with orders to apprehend him and bring him in for questioning. But from the moment they arrived, something felt very off. The estate was quiet, too quiet, and as they pushed deeper inside, they began finding bodies, Spencer's personal guards, highly trained security personnel, all dead. And not just dead, but brutally slaughtered. Many appeared to have been killed with impossible force, almost as if something far beyond human capability had torn through them. As they continued their search, they found themselves relentlessly pursued by grotesque creatures known as the Guardians of Insanity, powerful enemies that stalked them through the estate's corridors, gardens, and underground tunnels. At one point, an old bridge collapsed beneath them, sending both agents crashing into the sewers below. Separated from much of their equipment and trapped underground, they were forced to rely on their experience and teamwork to survive. And that's what made Chris and Jill such an effective partnership. Neither needed to tell the other what to do. They trusted each other completely. Every decision, every fight, and every mission. For nearly a decade, they had been side by side through it all. Which is exactly why what happened next hit Chris so hard. Eventually, the pair reached Spencer's private chamber, the place where all their answers were waiting, or so they thought, because when they entered the room, Spencer was already dead, and standing over his body was Albert Wesker. For the first time in ages, Chris came face to face with the man who had haunted him for years, the man responsible for the destruction of stars, the betrayal at the Spencer mansion, and the countless deaths that followed. But this reunion was nothing like Chris imagined, because before he could get any answers, Wesker attacked. Despite years of training, combat experience, and countless battles against bioweapons, Chris and Jill were completely overwhelmed. Wesker was faster, stronger, and seemingly unstoppable. And then came the moment that would haunt him for years. As Wesker prepared to kill Chris, Jill made a decision. Without hesitation, she threw herself at Wesker, grabbing him and driving both of them through a nearby window. Chris could only watch as his partner disappeared into the darkness below. And then, she was gone, just like that. The woman who had fought beside him since the days of stars, the person he trusted more than anyone else. Jill Valentine had vanished in an instant. Eventually, the BSAA launched a massive search operation. For months, teams combed the area looking for any sign of Jill, but they found nothing. And eventually, Jill was officially declared killed in action. Most people accepted it, but Chris didn't. He couldn't. Deep down, something told him the story wasn't over. And for the next 3 years, Chris threw himself into mission after mission, partly because it was his job, but mostly because he was searching for answers, searching for Wesker, and searching for any sign that Jill might still be alive. Because despite what everyone else believed, Chris refused to give up on her. And one day, that determination would finally pay off. By 2009, Chris Redfield had become one of the BSAA's most accomplished agents. No one had participated in more operations, no one had more experience fighting bioterror threats, and no one carried more scars from the war against bioweapons. But despite everything he had accomplished, there were still two things he couldn't let go of: Albert Wesker and Jill Valentine. For 3 years, Chris had searched for answers. 3 years of rumors, 3 years of dead ends, and 3 years of refusing to believe Jill was truly gone. And then, he finally received a lead. Intelligence reports suggested a massive bioweapons transaction was about to take place in the Kijuju Autonomous Zone of Africa. At first, it seemed like another routine operation, but Chris quickly discovered that something much bigger was unfolding. Partnered with BSAA operative Sheva Alomar, he was deployed to Kijuju with orders to locate and apprehend a black market bioweapons dealer named Ricardo Irving. What neither of them realized was that this mission would change Chris's life forever. From the moment they arrived, something felt wrong. The streets were tense, the locals were hostile, and before long, the entire situation exploded into chaos. The population had become infected with a new strain of Las Plagas. Ordinary citizens transformed into violent creatures known as Majini. Entire neighborhoods descended into madness. And once again, Chris found himself fighting for survival in the middle of a biohazard outbreak. As the mission spiraled out of control, BSAA teams began disappearing. Agents were slaughtered, convoys were destroyed, and one by one, Chris watched more good people die. It was a grim reminder of Raccoon City, of the Spencer Mansion, and of every operation that had gone wrong before. But amid the chaos, Chris uncovered something unexpected. A photograph, one that stopped him in his tracks. The image appeared to show Jill Valentine alive, and at first, Chris could hardly believe it. For years, he had held on to hope, and now, for the first time, he had evidence. And just like that, this mission became personal. As Chris and Sheva continued their pursuit of Irving, they uncovered a far larger conspiracy involving Tricell, a powerful pharmaceutical corporation, as well as a deadly new virus known as Ouroboros. And the deeper they dug, the more one name continued to surface: Albert Wesker. Even after all these years, Wesker was still pulling the strings, still manipulating events from the shadows, and still spreading death wherever he went. And this time, Chris was determined to stop him, no matter the cost. Eventually, the investigation led them deep beneath Africa into the ruins where Umbrella's founders first discovered the progenitor virus, the very place where so much of Resident Evil's history began. There, Chris finally received confirmation of what he had suspected all along. Jill was alive, but the truth was far worse than he imagined. When Chris finally came face to face with the mysterious figure that had been assisting Wesker throughout the operation, he was stunned. The masked woman wasn't a stranger. It was Jill, but under Wesker's control. For a moment, Chris could barely process what he was seeing. The partner he had believed he had lost, the friend he had spent years searching for, had been turned into one of Wesker's weapons, and now she was standing against him. The battle that followed was one of the most emotional moments of Chris's life, because he didn't want to fight Jill, he wanted to save her. Even while she attacked him, Chris refused to give up on her, refused to see her as an enemy, and eventually he noticed something attached to her chest, a control device, the source of Wesker's influence. Working together, Chris and Sheva managed to remove it, and for the first time in 3 years, Jill was finally free. Unfortunately, the reunion was brief. There wasn't time for explanations. Wesker was preparing to unleash Ouroboros on a global scale, and if they failed to stop him, millions could die. So once again, Jill asked Chris to leave her behind, and once again, Chris reluctantly moved forward, this time to end the nightmare once and for all. The final pursuit took Chris and Sheva aboard a massive tanker, where they confronted both Wesker and his ally Excellagione. By now, Wesker had become obsessed with his vision of evolution. He genuinely believed humanity needed to be replaced, that only the strong deserved to survive. To Chris, it was the final proof that the man he once respected was completely gone. After years of manipulation, betrayal, and murder, Wesker had become the very thing he always claimed to be above: a monster. The confrontation that followed pushed Chris and Sheva to their limits. Using the information provided by Jill, they discovered Wesker's powers depended on a specialized serum. An overdose could destabilize the virus inside his body, finally giving them a way to fight back. Now, for the first time since the Spencer Mansion, Wesker wasn't invincible. After an intense battle, Chris and Sheva successfully injected Wesker with the serum, weakening him enough to force a retreat. But Wesker wasn't finished. Not yet. The chase eventually ended in a volcanic mountainous area, and there, surrounded by lava and collapsing rock, Chris and Sheva made their final stand. Wesker, meanwhile, consumed by Ouroboros, transformed into a monstrous version of himself, the ultimate result of everything he had become. The battle was brutal, exhausting, and personal, because for Chris, this was the end of a war that had begun over a decade earlier. A war that started inside the Spencer mansion, a war that cost countless lives, and a war that took Jill away from him. And now finally, it was coming to an end. Together, Chris and Sheva defeated Wesker once and for all, and as Wesker made one final desperate attempt to survive, they fired a pair of rockets directly into him, ending the threat permanently. For the first time in years, it was over. Umbrella was gone, Wesker was dead, and Jill was finally free. Chris had achieved everything he set out to do, but as he looked toward the future, he understood something important. There would always be another Wesker, another outbreak, and another threat waiting to emerge. The fight would never truly be over, and before long, Chris Redfield would discover just how high that price would become. With Albert Wesker finally gone, many people assumed Chris would finally get the peace he had spent years fighting for. But peace never lasted long in Chris's world. The fall of Umbrella and the death of Wesker hadn't ended bioterrorism, and no matter how many threats were eliminated, another always seemed ready to take its place. So, instead of stepping away from the battlefield, Chris kept moving forward. By 2010, he had become one of the BSAA's most respected and experienced operatives. His reputation stretched across the organization, and few agents had participated in as many successful operations as he had. For newer recruits, Chris wasn't just another soldier, he was a living legend. One of those recruits was a young sniper named Piers Nivens. At the time, neither man realized how important they would become to each other's story. Their first operation together took place during a bioterror incident in the United States. When an outbreak occurred inside a shopping mall, Chris and his team were deployed to contain the threat before it could spread. The mission itself was over almost as quickly as it began. Years of experience allowed Chris and his team to eliminate the infected, secure the area, and rescue civilians without suffering a single casualty. To most people, it was just another successful operation. To Chris, it was proof that the BSAA was becoming exactly what he had always hoped it could be, an organization capable of stopping outbreaks before they became another Raccoon City. But while Chris was helping shape the future of the BSAA, a new generation of agents was beginning to look up to him, especially Piers. Not only was he impressed by Chris's reputation, but he admired his dedication, his leadership, and his refusal to give up no matter how difficult the mission became. Over time, Chris began to notice Piers's potential as well. The young sniper was talented, disciplined, and possessed many of the same qualities Chris had valued throughout his own career. Without realizing it, Chris had started becoming what he once needed himself, a mentor. In the years that followed, Chris and Piers participated in numerous operations throughout Asia and the Far East, responding to outbreaks and dismantling bioterror threats wherever they emerged. During one assignment, they met BSAA operative Miranda. The three quickly developed a strong friendship while working together across multiple missions, and for Chris, these years represented something he hadn't experienced in a long time, being stability. The BSAA was growing, Wesker was gone, Jill was recovering, and for the first time in years, Chris wasn't carrying the burden alone. He had people he could rely on. But sadly, in Resident Evil, those moments never last. In 2012, Chris was dispatched to investigate a mysterious outbreak at the prestigious Marhawa Academy. What initially appeared to be a localized incident quickly turned into a nightmare. By the time Chris arrived, the school had already descended into chaos. Students were transforming into monsters, teachers were dead, and a new virus was spreading rapidly throughout the campus. As Chris fought his way through the academy alongside Piers and Mirabiji, he found himself facing a familiar tragedy. Most of the victims weren't soldiers, they weren't trained operatives, but they were children, students who had their entire lives ahead of them. And once again, Chris found himself witnessing the human cost of bioterrorism firsthand. As the situation deteriorated, the team battled through waves of infected while searching for survivors and uncovering the source of the outbreak. Eventually, they managed to evacuate the remaining students and destroy the creature responsible, but victory came at a cost. During the final escape, Miranda tragically sacrificed herself to save Piers. Chris could do nothing but watch as another young operative lost her life, another name added to an already long list, another reminder that even when he won, people still died. For Piers, the loss was devastating, and for Chris, it was painfully familiar, because after everything he had experienced over the years, he knew exactly how much those losses could stay with a person. And unfortunately, far worse was still waiting for both of them, because the next outbreak wouldn't just cost lives, it would break Chris Redfield completely. By late 2012, Chris Redfield had survived countless outbreaks and spent years training the next generation of anti-bioterror operatives. From the outside, it looked like Chris had finally found his footing, but the war against bioterrorism was far from over. On December 24th of 2012, Chris and his team were deployed to the Eastern European nation of Edonia. A brutal civil war was already underway, but intelligence reports revealed something even more concerning. The rebels had acquired a new type of bioorganic weapon, the Juavo. Unlike zombies or Magini, the Juavo retained their intelligence, could use weapons, coordinate attacks, and adapt during combat. They were smarter, deadlier, and far more unpredictable than anything Chris had faced before. Leading Alpha Team, Chris entered the conflict alongside Piers, Finn, Carl, Ben, and Andy. For Chris, these weren't just soldiers, they were his team, men he had fought beside, and men who trusted him to bring them home. Before the mission began, Chris even took a moment to encourage Finn, the youngest and least experienced member of the squad. It was a small moment, but an important one, because by this point, Chris had become a mentor. But unfortunately, none of them knew what was waiting ahead. As the team advanced through Edonia, they quickly found themselves under heavy attack. Their armored vehicles were destroyed, Juavo soldiers appeared from every direction, and before long, the battlefield descended into chaos. And then things somehow became even worse. A massive creature known as an Ogroman entered the fight. Towering over the battlefield, it smashed through everything in its path while Chris and his team desperately fought to survive. Despite overwhelming odds, they managed to push forward. Time and time again, Chris led his squad through impossible situations. But eventually, they arrived at a location that would change everything. A government building deep within the city. And inside, they encountered a woman claiming to be Ada Wong. At first, she appeared helpful. She explained the existence of the C virus, revealed the involvement of the new organization Neo Umbrella, and offered information that seemed vital to the mission. But it was all a lie. The woman had been manipulating them from the start, and before Chris realized what was happening, it was already too late. Separated from the rest of his squad, Chris watched helplessly as the mysterious woman unleashed the C virus directly onto his team. One by one, his soldiers became infected. Andy, Carl, Ben, and Finn, all men he was responsible for protecting. But now, Chris could do nothing but watch. Within moments, they began transforming into horrific creatures. Their bodies twisted, their minds disappeared, and the people Chris knew were gone. The situation became even more horrifying when Finn transformed directly in front of him. The same rookie Chris had encouraged earlier, and the same young soldier with his entire future ahead of him, now reduced to another victim of bioterrorism. Chris tried to fight back. He tried to save them and tried to do something, anything, but there was nothing he could do. Chris was completely powerless. Beaten, overwhelmed, and mentally shattered, he was dragged from the battlefield by Piers as BSAA reinforcements arrived to put down the mutated squad. By the end of the operation, everyone was dead. Everyone except Chris and Piers. And for Chris, that was somehow even worse. When he eventually regained consciousness in a hospital, his mind simply couldn't process what had happened. The trauma, the guilt, the loss, it was too much. As a result, Chris suffered from severe amnesia and could barely remember who he was. But even without his memories, the pain remained. Somewhere deep down, he knew something terrible had happened, and rather than face it, he ran. For the next 6 months, Chris disappeared. The legendary BSAA captain vanished without a trace. No missions, no teammates, and no purpose. Instead, he drifted from place to place across Eastern Europe, spending his days in bars and taking odd jobs simply to survive. The man who once stood as a symbol of hope against bioterrorism became a shadow of himself, broken, angry, and lost. The regulars at one particular bar even gave him a nickname called the Stray Dog, a fitting description for a man with nowhere left to go. But while Chris tried to bury his past, there was one person who refused to give up on him: Piers Nivens. For 6 months, Piers searched relentlessly for his former captain, not because it was his duty, but because he genuinely believed Chris was worth saving. And eventually, he found him, sitting alone in a bar, drunk, defeated, and barely recognizable. For most people, this would have been the end of Chris Redfield's story. But Piers wasn't most people, because while Chris had spent years saving others, now it was finally someone else's turn to save him. After 6 months of living as a ghost, Chris was finally back. His memories and his purpose had returned, but the guilt never left. The faces of Finn, Carl, Ben, and Andy still haunted him. Every mission, every quiet moment, every time he looked at Piers. Because while Chris had survived Edonia, his team hadn't. And no matter how hard he tried, part of him still blamed himself. But unfortunately, there wasn't time to dwell on the past, because while Chris had been missing, Neo Umbrella's plans had only continued to escalate. In June of 2013, another major bioterror attack erupted, this time in Lanshiang, China. And once again, Chris found himself leading a BSAA squad into the middle of a war zone. The city was already falling apart by the time they had arrived. Juavo were everywhere, buildings were burned, civilians were fleeing for their lives, and the scale of the outbreak beat anything Chris had seen in Edonia. Determined not to repeat his previous mistakes, Chris threw himself into the mission, but it quickly became clear that this operation wasn't just about stopping Neo Umbrella. It was about revenge, because the person responsible for Edonia was still out there. The woman Chris believed to be Ada Wong, the same woman he had blamed for the deaths of his squad, and the same woman he had spent 6 months trying to forget. And this time, he intended to make her pay. As Chris and his team fought through the city, they encountered wave after wave of increasingly dangerous bioweapons. Juavo, crystallids, mutated creatures unlike anything they had seen before. And before long, history began repeating itself. One by one, members of Chris's new squad started dying, and Chris was once again forced to watch good soldiers fall. The worst moment came when one of his men, Marco, was infected right in front of him. Chris had seen this before, too many times, and he knew exactly how it would end. And once again, he was forced to put down someone under his command. Afterward, Piers finally confronted him. For months, Piers had watched Chris bury himself in anger, watch him obsess over revenge, and watch him slowly lose sight of why he became a soldier in the first place. And for perhaps the first time in their relationship, Piers challenged him, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. And the conversation hit harder than Chris expected, because deep down, Piers was right. Chris wasn't chasing justice anymore, he was chasing revenge. That realization became even more important when Chris crossed paths with Leon Kennedy. The two legends of Resident Evil finally found themselves standing on opposite sides of a standoff. Chris wanted Ada dead, Leon wanted answers, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the situation might erupt into violence. But Leon reminded Chris of something he desperately needed to hear. The mission wasn't about personal vengeance. It was about stopping the people responsible, not satisfying his anger. And finally, Chris listened. For the first time since Edonia, he let go of his obsession. Not completely, but enough to see clearly again. Enough to become the leader Piers believed he could be. But unfortunately, the battle was far from over. As the truth behind Neo Umbrella unraveled, Chris discovered something that shocked him. Jake Mueller, the mercenary he encountered back in Edonia, was Albert Wesker's son. The revelation caught him completely off guard. For years, Wesker had been the center of Chris's life, his greatest enemy, the source of countless tragedies, and now his son was standing right in front of him. Yet despite everything, Chris chose not to judge Jake for his father's actions, perhaps because he understood better than anyone that people aren't defined by where they come from. They're defined by the choices they make, and Jake was making the right ones. Soon after, the situation reached its final stage deep within Neo Umbrella's underwater facility. There, Chris came face to face with the organization's ultimate weapon, Chaos, a massive bioorganic weapon capable of spreading the sea virus across the entire planet. If it escaped, the consequences would be catastrophic. Knowing the stakes, Chris and Piers stayed behind to stop it, while Jake and Sherry had escaped. Together, the two soldiers launched one final assault. But during the battle, disaster struck. Piers suffered a devastating injury to his arm, and with Chaos continuing to evolve, the situation rapidly became hopeless. For most people, that would have been the end. But Piers made a choice that would forever change Chris Redfield's life. Using a sample of the enhanced sea virus, Piers infected himself. Not for power, not for survival, but to save Chris. The transformation granted him incredible abilities, enough to continue fighting, enough to stop Chaos, and enough to protect the man he respected most. For Chris, it was a horrifying sight, because he had spent his entire life watching people sacrifice themselves, and now it was happening again, this time right in front of him. Together, the two finally destroyed Chaos. The mission was complete and the world was safe, but the victory came at a terrible cost. As the underwater facility collapsed around them, Piers realized the infection was spreading. Soon, he would lose control, and soon, he would become a monster. And Piers refused to let that happen. No matter how much Chris argued, and no matter how much he begged, Piers had already made his decision. For years, Chris had been the one saving everyone else. Now, it was Piers' turn to save him. Locking Chris inside an escape pod, Piers launched him to safety, leaving himself behind. Then, just as Chris watched the pod sink beneath the ocean, Chaos made one final attempt to attack, and in his final act, Piers stopped it, using the last of his strength to protect Chris one final time. Then, moments later, the facility exploded, and Piers Nivens was gone. For Chris, this loss was devastating, not just because he lost a partner and a friend, but because Piers represented something more, being hope, the future, the next generation of soldiers willing to fight for the right reasons. And in the end, Piers accomplished something nobody else managed to do. He saved Chris Redfield. He reminded him why he started fighting in the first place. Following the incident, Chris briefly considered retirement. After everything he had been through, who could blame him? But in the end, he chose to continue, because that's what Piers would have wanted. And from that day forward, every mission Chris took, every life he had saved, and every battle he fought, it all carried a piece of Piers Nivens with him. By 2014, Chris had returned to active duty and was once again leading operations against bioterror threats around the world. The wounds left by Lanshiang were still there. The memories of Piers were still there. But Chris had made a promise to keep moving forward, and that's exactly what he did. During one operation in the Mojave Desert, Chris received an unexpected call from Claire. His younger sister had become involved in another dangerous bioterror incident and needed help. Under normal circumstances, Chris would have dropped everything to protect her, just as he had done countless times before. But this time, he couldn't. His mission with the BSAA prevented him from reaching her in time. Instead, Chris did the next best thing. He dispatched a trusted team led by Parker Luciani to assist Claire while he continued his operation. and this shows just how much Chris had changed over the years. The young STARS officer who had once charged headfirst into danger to save the people he cared about had become a leader responsible for far more than himself. He couldn't be everywhere at once. He couldn't save everyone personally, and learning to accept that had become one of the hardest lessons of his life. Still, even from thousands of miles away, Chris never stopped looking out for Claire, because no matter how much the world changed, the bond between the Redfield siblings never did. That same year, new viruses continued to emerge, and new people continued trying to profit from biological weapons. One of those people was Glenn Arias, a former CIA operative turned international arms dealer with deep connections to the bioweapons black market. Intelligence suggested Arias had begun dealing in B.O.Ws and dangerous viral weapons, making him one of the BSAA's highest priority targets. Determined to stop him, the BSAA partnered with Mexican Special Forces and launched an operation to apprehend Arias at a secluded mansion in Mexico. For Chris, it seemed like a straightforward mission. Get in, capture Arias, rescue any hostages, and get out. But instead, it became yet another nightmare. The moment Chris and his team entered the estate, they were ambushed. Hordes of zombies emerged from every direction. Entire squads were overwhelmed within minutes. And to Chris's horror, one of the infected was Zach White, the son of a missing BSAA operative they had come to rescue. As the battle intensified, Chris witnessed something even more disturbing, a new type of mutation, one unlike anything he had encountered before. The situation had rapidly spiraled out of control. The Mexican Special Forces unit accompanying him was wiped out, and the mission itself had collapsed. Chris barely escaped with his life, and after being forced from the mansion, he finally came face to face with Glenn Arias himself. But the encounter did not go as planned. Despite all of Chris's experience, Arias proved to be a dangerous fighter and quickly gained the upper hand. Then, Arias delivered one final cruel blow, introducing the zombified Kathy White, the very operative Chris had been sent to rescue. Watching another innocent life lost to bioterrorism hit Chris hard, and as Arias disappeared into the shadows, Chris found himself carrying something he thought he'd left behind years ago, being a personal grudge. The following months, a series of mysterious massacres began occurring around the Great Lakes region. Entire communities were being slaughtered. The attacks seemed random, but Chris knew better. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The investigation eventually led him to the Alexander Institute of Biotechnology in Chicago, where his old friend Rebecca Chambers was helping develop a vaccine for a newly discovered virus. Unfortunately, by the time Chris arrived, the outbreak had already reached the facility. Once again, he found himself fighting through infected hordes to save the people trapped inside. Thankfully, Rebecca had survived, but what she discovered was alarming. The virus showed similarities to Las Plagas, meaning someone had found a way to combine multiple bioweapon technologies into something entirely new. Realizing the threat was escalating beyond the BSAA's resources, Chris sought out someone he trusted, Leon S. Kennedy. The two men had crossed paths before, but this would become one of their most significant partnerships. When Chris found Leon, however, he wasn't exactly eager to help. Years of loss and trauma had taken their toll. Much like Chris after Edonia, Leon was struggling with his own trauma. But after learning the scale of Arias' plans, he eventually agreed to join the mission. Together, Chris, Leon, Rebecca, and a BSAA strike team traced the conspiracy to New York City. And that's when everything fell apart. Arias unleashed his new virus across the city. Citizens transformed into zombies. Entire streets descended into chaos, and New York became the center of yet another bioterror catastrophe. Determined to prevent another disaster, Chris and Leon launched a full-scale assault against Arias' operation. The two veterans fought their way through the infected streets, destroying viral distribution trucks and rescuing survivors wherever possible. But Arias had one final surprise waiting. Rebecca had been infected, and unless Chris could obtain the vaccine quickly, she would become another casualty. With time running out, Chris pushed forward through Arias' stronghold, fighting countless infected along the way, and eventually, his pursuit led him directly to Arias himself. What followed was one of the most brutal hand-to-hand fights of Chris's career. Neither man was willing to back down. The battle raged across the rooftop as both fighters pushed themselves to their limits. But just when it seemed like Arias was finally beaten, he transformed, fusing with another mutated creature and becoming a monstrous bioweapon. The situation immediately became desperate. Even Chris and Leon struggled against the creature's overwhelming strength. Yet after everything they had survived over the years, neither was willing to quit. Working together, they finally managed to destroy Arias once and for all. And with the vaccine finally secured, Rebecca was saved. The infected citizens of New York were cured, and another global catastrophe was prevented. As the dust settled, Chris found himself standing alongside Leon and Rebecca, 3 survivors who had endured more than most people could imagine. 3 people who understood better than anyone the cost of this endless war. And once Leon questioned whether the fight against bioterrorism would ever truly end, Chris gave a small smile. After everything he had been through, he already knew the answer. There would always be another mission, another outbreak, another threat waiting somewhere in the shadows. And as long as that remained true, Chris Redfield would keep fighting. By 2015, Chris Redfield had spent nearly half his life fighting bioterrorism. For most people, that kind of constant war would eventually wear them down, and in many ways, it already had. Years of outbreaks, years of losing teammates, and years of watching innocent people become victims. The burden never truly disappeared, but Chris kept moving forward because he believed someone had to. That year, a series of mysterious deaths began occurring across San Francisco. At first, the incidents didn't resemble a typical outbreak. Victims were turning into zombies, yet there were no bites, no obvious infections, and no clear explanation. Even for the BSAA, it was unusual. To investigate, Chris was partnered once again with Jill Valentine, and for the first time in years, the legendary Stars duo was back in the field together. And while Jill had physically recovered from everything Wesker put her through, Chris could tell something still weighed heavily on her. The guilt, the memories, the feeling that she could never fully make up for what happened while she was under Wesker's control. During the investigation, Chris tried to get through to her, not as a captain, but as a friend, because if anyone understood the weight of survivors' guilt, it was Chris Redfield. He had been carrying it for years: the losses of Stars, the deaths in Edonia, the sacrifice of peers. Those memories never truly left him, and he didn't want Jill following the same path. At one point, Chris shared a realization that years of fighting had taught him, that the longer someone stays in this war, the easier it becomes to grow numb to it, and if they weren't careful, that numbness could eventually consume them. For Chris, it wasn't just advice, it was a warning born from experience. As the investigation continued, another familiar face entered the picture: Claire Redfield. Working through TerraSave, Claire had uncovered evidence linking the mysterious infections to Alcatraz Island. For Chris, it was one of those rare moments where his worlds collided: his partner, his sister, and the mission. Together, they all followed the trail to Alcatraz, disguising themselves as tourists while searching for answers. But unfortunately, they weren't the only ones there. Someone had been watching them from the very beginning, and within moments of arriving, chaos had erupted. Tourists suddenly began transforming into zombies. Panic spread throughout the island, and before long, Alcatraz descended into a full-scale outbreak. Separated from Jill and cut off from outside communication, Chris fought alongside Claire as they searched for survivors and tried to understand what was happening. But things quickly went from bad to worse when both Chris and Claire were infected. For perhaps the first time in years, Chris found himself facing the same fate as so many people he had tried to save. Locked inside a cell and slowly showing signs of infection, he could do nothing but wait. And for someone like Chris Redfield, that feeling of helplessness was unbearable. Soon, the mastermind behind the outbreak revealed himself, a former mercenary named Dylan Blake. Unlike many villains before him, Blake wasn't motivated by power or profit. He believed the entire system was broken. Governments, organizations, and even groups like the BSAA and TerraSafe. In his eyes, everyone was responsible for allowing bioterrorism to continue, and Chris became one of his primary targets. Blake mocked him relentlessly, pointing out every mission that ended in tragedy, every teammate who died under his command, and every sacrifice made along the way. For a moment, it almost felt as if Blake was weaponizing Chris's own guilt against him. But Chris had heard those accusations before, from enemies, from survivors, and sometimes even from himself. The difference was Chris had already spent years wrestling with those doubts, and unlike Blake, he understood something important. The world wasn't saved by giving up on it, it was saved by continuing to fight for it, no matter how difficult that fight became. Thankfully, Rebecca Chambers eventually arrived with a cure, freeing Chris, Claire, and the others before the infection could fully take hold. During the outbreak, Leon Kennedy joined the operation as well, and for perhaps the first time in Resident Evil history, 5 of the franchise's most important survivors were fighting together. Chris, Jill, Claire, Leon, and Rebecca, each carrying their own scars, each shaped by years of tragedy, yet all of them were still standing. The final battle led them deep into Alcatraz, where Dylan transformed into a monstrous bioweapon after fusing with infected marine life. The creature was enormous, powerful, and capable of unleashing devastation on a massive scale. But by this point, Chris wasn't facing it alone. Working together, the group coordinated their efforts, gradually weakening the monster before finally bringing it down once and for all. Once the battle finally ended, Chris found himself standing alongside Jill once again, something he wasn't always sure would happen. For years, the two had endured loss, separation, and countless battles, yet somehow, they always found their way back to the fight. And as reinforcements arrived to secure the island, Chris couldn't help but feel relieved. Not because the battle was over, he knew better than that, but because for the first time in a long time, the people he cared about were still standing beside him. And after everything he had lost over the years, that meant more than anything he could put into words. By 2017, Chris had been fighting bioterrorism for nearly 20 years. Most of the people he started this journey with were gone. Some had died, others had moved on, and the world itself had changed dramatically. But Chris remained exactly where he had always been, on the front lines, still fighting and still trying to stop the next outbreak before innocent people got caught in the crossfire. However, this next mission would be different. Because for the first time in years, Chris found himself working alongside a name he never expected to trust, Umbrella, or more specifically, Blue Umbrella. Following the collapse of the original corporation, a new company had emerged claiming to be dedicated to cleaning up the damage Umbrella left behind. They provided equipment, intelligence, and support during anti-bioterror operations. But Chris wasn't buying it, not completely. After everything Umbrella had done to his friends, his city, and the world, trust wasn't something he could simply hand over. Even years later, the name alone was enough to make him suspicious. Still, when intelligence linked a dangerous criminal organization known as the Connections to a new bioweapon outbreak in Dulvey, Louisiana, Chris reluctantly agreed to cooperate. The target was Lucas Baker, a sadistic survivor of the Baker Incident who possessed valuable information regarding a dangerous new biological weapon known as the Mold, and if Lucas escaped, countless lives could be at risk. As Chris and his team approached the Baker estate, however, they arrived just in time to witness something unbelievable. A civilian named Ethan Winters was fighting for his life against Evelyn, the powerful bioorganic weapon responsible for the entire nightmare in Louisiana. For most people, facing a creature like Evelyn would have been a death sentence, yet somehow, Ethan had survived everything the Baker family and the Mold could throw at him. Recognizing the opportunity, Chris and his team immediately provided support. They supplied Ethan with a specialized weapon and ammunition capable of damaging Evelyn, and together, they finally brought the creature down. With the threat neutralized, Chris helped evacuate Ethan and his wife Mia to safety. For Ethan, the nightmare was finally over. At least, that's what he thought. For Chris, however, the mission was only beginning, because while Ethan escaped Louisiana, Chris continued his pursuit of Lucas Baker. The operation quickly led him deep into the abandoned salt mines beneath the Baker property, and before long, Lucas began turning the entire mission into one giant game, a deadly game. Throughout the mines, Chris discovered evidence of Lucas's ties to the connections, while desperately searching for several missing soldiers. Unfortunately, Lucas always seemed one step ahead. Every rescue attempt turned into a trap. Every lead ended in disaster, and one by one, Chris watched the missing operatives die before he could save them. At one point, Lucas even managed to attach an explosive device directly to Chris's arm. For most people, that would have been the moment to retreat, but not Chris. Instead of falling back, he continued the mission, determined to stop Lucas no matter the risk. After surviving countless traps, molded attacks, and near-death encounters, Chris finally cornered his target. But Lucas wasn't finished yet. After suffering a fatal wound, he mutated into a monstrous creature enhanced by the mold. And once again, Chris found himself facing another bioorganic nightmare. The battle was intense, but by this point in his life, Chris had faced tyrants, Wesker, Ouroboros, Hayas, and countless other monsters. Lucas Baker wasn't going to be the one who stopped him. After a brutal confrontation, Chris finally put him down for good. More importantly, he destroyed Lucas's research before it could be sold to outside buyers, preventing yet another dangerous bioweapon from spreading across the world. For most people, that would have been the end of the story, but Chris wasn't quite finished with the Baker family. Sometime later, Ethan Winters contacted him with a personal request: find Zoe Baker, the one member of the family who had helped Ethan survive the nightmare, and Chris reluctantly agreed. After investigating reports from the Louisiana swamplands, he eventually located Zoe alive alongside her uncle Joe Baker. With the danger finally over, Chris arranged for Zoe's rescue and personally contacted Ethan to deliver the good news. It was a small moment, and it's one that rarely gets talked about, but it showed something important about Chris. After decades of fighting monsters and stopping outbreaks, he still cared about the people caught in the middle of them, because despite everything he had endured, the losses, the trauma, and the endless battles, Chris never forgot why he was fighting in the first place: to save people. And before long, a new threat would emerge that would test that belief more than ever before. By 2021, Chris was no longer the same man who had survived the Spencer Mansion. Decades of warfare had changed him. The losses, the sacrifices, the constant cycle of outbreaks and disasters, it had all left its mark. While Chris never stopped fighting, he had become increasingly distrustful of the organizations around him, including the BSAA itself. Something wasn't right. The deeper he looked, the more secrets he uncovered. And for perhaps the first time since Umbrella's downfall, Chris began questioning whether the very organization he helped build could still be trusted. At the same time, another threat had quietly emerged: a mysterious woman known as Mother Miranda. She was a scientist, a cult leader, and one of the most dangerous individuals Chris had ever investigated. For years, Miranda had been conducting experiments involving a powerful mutagen known as the mold, the same organism responsible for the Baker Incident in Louisiana. As Chris dug deeper into her activities, he made a disturbing discovery. Miranda had become obsessed with a child, Rosemary Winters, the daughter of Ethan and Mia Winters. And if Chris was right, Rose was in grave danger. Determined to stop Miranda before she could make her move, Chris launched a covert operation against the Winters household. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments of his entire career. Without warning, Chris and his team stormed the Winters residence, and moments later, he shot Mia Winters right in front of Ethan. Then, he dragged Ethan away without offering a single explanation. To Ethan, it looked like Chris Redfield had completely lost his mind, But the truth was far more complicated. The woman Chris shot wasn't Mia, it was Miranda. Using her ability to perfectly imitate others, she had been living among the Winters family while preparing to abduct Rose. Chris believed he had eliminated the threat, but unfortunately, Miranda survived, and within hours, everything spiraled out of control. The transport carrying Ethan, Rose, and Miranda was attacked. Miranda escaped, and Rose was kidnapped, and Ethan disappeared somewhere within a remote village in Eastern Europe. As Chris entered the region with his Hound Wolf squad, he began searching for answers, but almost immediately, he started finding evidence of Ethan's presence. Dead lichens, destroyed creatures, entire sections of the village left in ruins. Everywhere Chris looked, Ethan Winters was somehow surviving situations that should have killed him. Meanwhile, Chris's team uncovered something even more alarming. The mold infecting the village was almost identical to the one encountered in Louisiana, meaning the entire nightmare traced back to the same source. The connections, Miranda, and the events that began years earlier with Evelyn. Eventually, Chris crossed paths with Ethan, and let's just say their reunion wasn't exactly friendly. Ethan was furious. From his perspective, Chris had murdered his wife, kidnapped his family, and refused to explain anything. And honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. For years, Chris had developed a habit of carrying burdens alone, keeping secrets, making decisions for other people, and trying to protect them by withholding information. And this time, it completely backfired. When Ethan demanded answers, Chris finally told him the truth. The Mia he shot was Miranda in disguise. Rose had been targeted from the very beginning, and the entire village existed because of Miranda's experiments with the mold. For the first time, Chris stopped treating Ethan like a civilian and started treating him like a partner. But unfortunately, the damage had already been done. Soon after, Ethan confronted Miranda himself and quickly paid the price. Once Chris learned Miranda had apparently killed Ethan, the guilt hit him hard, because deep down, he knew things might have gone differently if he had simply trusted Ethan from the start. It's one of the few times in Resident Evil where Chris openly acknowledges his own mistake. He admits he handled the situation poorly. He admits he should have told Ethan the truth. And for a man as stubborn as Chris Redfield, that's a pretty big moment. Determined to finish the mission, Chris led Hound Wolf Squad deeper into the village. Along the way, he finally discovered the real Mia alive and imprisoned inside Miranda's laboratory. Relieved to find her alive, Chris delivered the news. But then came the conversation he was dreading, telling Mia that Ethan was dead, or at least that he believed Ethan was dead. Yet even then, Mia refused to give up hope, and in doing so, she revealed one final truth, a truth that explained everything. Ever since Louisiana, Ethan himself had been infected by the mold. The man Chris had spent years looking after wasn't entirely human anymore, which somehow made his survival make a lot more sense. As the final battle began, Chris launched an assault on Miranda's ceremony site, while Ethan made one last push to rescue Rose. Together, the two men finally brought Miranda down, but victory came at a terrible cost. The massive fungal root beneath the village had become unstable. The entire region was moments away from destruction. As Chris rushed to evacuate everyone, Ethan made a decision. The same decision countless people before him had made. The same choice Jill made, and the same choice Piers made. Ethan chose to stay behind. Knowing he was dying, knowing there was no way out, and knowing he would never see his family again, Ethan handed Rose to Chris and made him promise to protect her. Then he looked at the detonator and walked away. For perhaps the first time in years, Chris was powerless to stop it. All he could do was watch. Moments later, the explosion consumed the village, and Ethan Winters was gone. As Chris sat aboard the evacuation helicopter, Rose safe in his arms, the weight of everything finally settled in. Another hero had fallen, another family had been shattered, and another person sacrificed themselves so others could live. But before the operation ended, Chris uncovered one final shock. A dead BSAA operative recovered from the village wasn't human. It was a bioorganic weapon, the very thing the BSAA was created to stop. For Chris, that discovery changed everything, because suddenly the enemy wasn't just Miranda, or the connections, or some rogue bioterrorist. It might be the BSAA itself. As the helicopter disappeared into the night, Chris issued a new order, set a course for BSAA Europe, because after everything he'd learned, he was finally done looking the other way. And whatever answers were waiting for him there, he intended to find them. Even after the village incident, Chris Redfield's fight wasn't over. If anything, it had only become more complicated. The discovery of BSAA soldiers being deployed as bioorganic weapons raised questions Chris couldn't ignore. Questions about corruption, questions about hidden agendas, and questions about who was really pulling the strings behind the scenes. Over the following years, Chris continued investigating these mysteries alongside his trusted Hound Wolf squad. His search eventually led him back to a place he never thought he'd have to revisit, Raccoon City, more specifically, what remained beneath it. Rumors began circulating that the destruction of Raccoon City may have hidden far more than anyone realized, that deep beneath the ruins existed a secret facility known as ARC, a laboratory with ties to Umbrella, the connections, and the development of biological weapons. And as Chris dug deeper, another name repeatedly surfaced. Elpis, a mysterious project connected to the facility and potentially linked to some of the darkest secrets still buried beneath Raccoon City. Then came troubling news. A BSAA unit sent to investigate the area had vanished, killed before they could uncover the truth, which only convinced Chris that whatever was hidden there was important. Soon afterward, he learned that Leon S. Kennedy had become involved in the investigation as well, and without hesitation, Chris dispatched the Hound Wolf squad to assist. Their objective was simple: find Leon, get him out alive, and learn whatever they could about Elpis. Thankfully, the mission was successful. Leon and FBI analyst Grace Ashcroft were safely extracted from the ruins, and before they left, Chris sent Leon a message through his team. And this small moment showed something important. After decades of fighting separate battles, Chris and Leon were still standing, still investigating, still protecting people, and still uncovering the truth behind the world's newest bioterror threats. Because while many of the heroes of Resident Evil had earned their peace, Chris Redfield never stopped searching for answers. And as long as new threats continued to emerge from the shadows, he never would. Years passed after the village incident. Mother Miranda was gone, the village had been destroyed, and Ethan Winters had sacrificed everything to save his family. Before his death, Ethan entrusted Chris with one final responsibility: Rosemary Winters, and true to his word, Chris kept that promise. Over the years, Chris became a regular part of Rose's life, and became someone who genuinely cared about her, someone who wanted to make sure Ethan's sacrifice had meant something. Despite his tough reputation, Rose quickly grew close to him. Whenever they met, she would often run up and hug him without hesitation, a rare reminder that beneath all the years of warfare and hardship, Chris still had a softer side that very few people ever got to see. As Rose grew older, however, it became clear she wasn't an ordinary child. The events surrounding Miranda had left her with extraordinary abilities connected to the mold, abilities that she struggled to fully understand, and abilities that frightened many people around her. Whenever those powers surfaced, Chris often found himself stepping in to defend her. Whether it was nervous teachers or concerned officials, Chris repeatedly reassured others that Rose wasn't dangerous, that she wasn't a weapon. She was just a kid trying to live a normal life. Perhaps more than anyone, Chris understood what it felt like to have people judged for things beyond their control, because for most of his life, he had watched innocent people become victims of circumstances they never chose. As Rose got older, Chris also honored another promise. He made sure she could protect herself. Together with members of Hound Wolf's squad, he helped teach her the basics of combat and firearms training. Eventually, Chris even offered her a place alongside his own operation, an invitation that Rose initially refused. After witnessing firsthand the dangers of Chris and Hound Wolf Squad faced on a regular basis, she wasn't eager to throw herself into that life. But as time passed, and after confronting the truth about her powers, Rose began seeing things differently. She finally accepted Chris's offer, choosing to step forward rather than run from who she was, just like Ethan had and just like Chris had. And although Rose still kept certain secrets about the full extent of her abilities, Chris welcomed her onto the team all the same. By that point, Chris had spent nearly 40 years fighting bioterrorism, and standing beside Rose, the daughter of a man who gave everything to save his family, Chris found something he had spent his entire life fighting for: a hope for the future. When you look back on Chris Redfield's story, one thing becomes clear. Resident Evil didn't just challenge him, it broke him, over and over again. He watched teammates die, he lost friends, he saw entire cities destroyed, and carried the weight of every life he couldn't protect. From the Spencer Mansion to Raccoon City, from Kijuju to Edonia, from Lanshiang to the Village Incident, Chris was constantly forced to endure tragedies that would have broken most people completely, and for a time, they almost did. We saw him consumed by guilt after losing his squad in Edonia. We saw him lose Jill and spend years refusing to accept she was gone. We saw him struggle with the burden of leadership, knowing every decision he made could mean life or death for the people under his command. Yet somehow, every time Chris was knocked down, he got back up, because he refused to let those sacrifices be meaningless. At his core, Chris has always been defined by one thing: perseverance. No matter how many friends he lost, no matter how many failures haunted him, and no matter how much guilt he carried, he always found a reason to keep fighting. And maybe that's why Chris remains one of the most respected characters in Resident Evil history, because no matter how much he lost, he always got back up. And as long as bioterrorism continues to threaten the world, Chris Redfield will keep fighting, because after all these years, he still hasn't given up, and he probably never will.